Gay Trans Man in a Hole, The Life of Lou Sullivan. This video uses Kurt Vonnegut's Man in a Hole narrative structure, hence the title. We begin our journey here, Lou Sullivan's early life. He was born in 1951 and by age 11 began recording his life in a diary. Many of these thoughts gave insight into a very self-reflective, closeted trans boy, such as this excerpt from 1965. I look in the mirror and I say to myself, that's you, dead name. That girl over there is you. It seems so funny. This self-reflection from a young age set Lou up for success as a changemaker, as he began the quest of self-knowing at a young age and was able to act according to his values when it counted later. We're now at this point in his narrative structure. In the early 1970s, Lou met someone who would become his mentor, Eldon E. Murray, the founder of Gay People's Union. They met at a meeting. Lou confided his feelings in Eldon, and Eldon urged him to, quote, read up about transsexuals, which he found to be very helpful in discovering himself. Lou began writing for GPU News under Eldon as well, some of which his articles were featured in other queer news outlets. He also began integrating more and more men's clothing into his everyday wardrobe. Then something happened in 1975. He was threatened at a laundromat by a group of boys who called him the F-slur and said they were going to beat him up. He outran them and went to Eldon's apartment, who was nearby. Eldon said that Milwaukee wasn't good for him anymore, and Lou agreed, saying that he needed to move away. Which he did. This was the uptick of his life. In 1975, he left Milwaukee and moved to San Francisco with his boyfriend. The parting was extremely wholesome, as his family has always been supportive, but gave him a going-away gift, which consisted of a nice suit and his grandfather's pocket watch with the engraving, "Go West, Young Man." This was not an easy decision, but it demonstrates how change can be scary but extremely beneficial, as this was the main uptick in his life story. His beginning life in San Francisco kind of got off to a rocky start. He was still presenting as a woman in his job as a secretary, but most of the time he was fully presenting as a gay man. He hung out at gay bars and enjoyed, quote, an adventurous sex life. But when he sought out gender-affirming surgery, he was repeatedly denied because patients had to be heterosexual. Lou embodied his strong sense of self and how he refused to deny his gay identity in order to get medical care. These repeated rejections were painful, but it became extremely valuable as Lou began the next chapter of his life, the peak, his life in San Francisco. Lou's frustration empowered him to successfully campaign for the removal of heterosexuality as a requirement for gender-affirming care. This could be considered the beginning of his advocacy journey. He found that most queer organizations were focused on trans feminine people, so he was also a pioneer in becoming the first FTM peer counselor in San Francisco. He wrote the earliest informational booklet for trans men, which discussed the transgender experience, some of which I still think is relatable, and also challenged the status quo in his insightful discussions about societal conceptions of gender, some of which are still being grappled with today. In 1979, Lou was finally able to take testosterone and also got top surgery and a new job presenting as his authentic self. He had bottom surgery in 1968, but that same year he was diagnosed with HIV. After his diagnosis, Lou continued living in San Francisco and continued his advocacy and supporting fellow transgender men. He died from AIDS in 1991 of AIDS-related illnesses. He did this after making plans to ensure that the organization he created would continue, like a mailing list of about 230 names, a roll of stamps, a model of the inclusion model he used for his support group, and the hope that a trans mask community would someday exist. His successors, including Jamieson Green, continued and built upon his work, as changemakers often do. This is a quote that I found quite profound. Though Lou Sullivan's last years were spent battling AIDS, he was surrounded by people and dedicated to a cause he deeply cared for. He's a great example of a changemaker who was aligned with and acting on his values. He devoted his final years to building the network of FTM contacts he had gathered over the years into his organization, FTM International. This eventually became a visible movement. Despite his declining health, he also continued to answer many letters he received from trans men around the world, hoping to dispel the sense of isolation he had felt. Lou was the true changemaker in the transmasculine community. His work genuinely, tangibly advocated for greater acceptance and understanding of transgender men within the LGBTQ community, especially with how he showed that sexuality and gender identity are separate. His work contributed to knowledge of the transmasculine experience, of gender identity and expression, and the understanding of transgender men and their needs, things I, as a present-day transmasculine guy, am incredibly grateful for.